I never thought about this. ESPN's Ben Baby, whoever that is, that's a fresh name, has come under fire on social media from WNBA fans after he raised questions about why reporters are denied access to locker rooms for post-game player interviews. Now, immediately you start thinking he's trying to get the Freak-a-Leak on. You know what I'm saying? You're thinking Petey Pablo over here, like Freak-a-Leak. No, it doesn't always have to be that way.
Picture this. A male NFL reporter, someone whose entire career is built around covering football, wakes up one morning, sees the WNBA season tipping off, and decides today is the day he publicly demands access to women's locker rooms. He hits send, and within 48 hours, his name is trending for all the wrong reasons. That one tweet didn't just start debate. It cracked open something much deeper, a fault line that has been quietly splitting the sports media world in two. Because this story isn't really about one reporter and one bad take. It's about power, privacy, and a media machine that spent 2 decades dismissing women's basketball and is now showing up late, loud, and completely entitled, expecting a VIP pass to everything. And before this is over, a former NFL Pro Bowler is going to say something so blunt, so brutally accurate, that it stops the entire argument cold. Drop this in the comments right now. Should all major sports have identical locker room access policies? Or does gender change everything? Because by the end of this video, your answer might surprise you. Here is what most people covering this story got completely wrong. Ben Baby is not a WNBA reporter. He is not a women's basketball analyst. He covers the Cincinnati Bengals. His world is defensive line rotations, quarterback contracts, and post-game press conferences held in a room full of men in towels. That is his beat. That is his expertise. So when the WNBA season opened and he decided to log online and declare in front of the entire sports internet,
Days old, ESPN's Ben Baby has drawn significant backlash for questioning the policy of the WNBA's locker room access. All right, it still remains wholly ridiculous that the WNBA doesn't have an open locker room media policy. He covers the Cincinnati Bengals for ESPN, the only major sport in the U.S. that doesn't have it. Bad for the fans and growth for the game.
That the league's locker room policy was, and I quote, wholly ridiculous. He wasn't speaking from any place of authority. He was a football guy parachuting into a conversation he had no business leading, and the internet noticed immediately. But here is where it gets genuinely interesting. What does locker room access actually mean? Because the phrase gets thrown around like everyone agrees on the definition, and they absolutely do not. In the NFL and NBA, open locker room policies allow credentialed reporters, male and female, to enter after a cooling off period, typically around 10 minutes post-game. Athletes are still dressing, still receiving treatment, still in a deeply vulnerable physical state. Reporters are standing 3 feet away with microphones and cameras. That is not a metaphor. That is a literal reality of professional sports journalism in America. So when someone demands the WNBA adopt that same policy, they are not asking for a press conference. They are asking for that. Not only does the WNBA currently conduct all post-game interviews in a designated media room.
Fans and growth for the game. While Baby's intention was to argue that greater locker room access for reporters would help boost the WNBA's popularity, I don't see how it hurts. Think about it. If you get those immediate emotional comments from athletes before they get a time to clean up not only their bodies, but their minds, they get time away. The longer you let them get away, the more calculated they're going to become. Right? You're not going to get that primal lizard brain response you want. You're going to get that, well, my publicist has already called me on the way home and I know what to say now. We don't want that. We want that gangster.
But those interviews consistently produce the same quality of access, quotes, and story material that reporters claim they can only get in a locker room. The locker room, it turns out, was never really about the journalism. So why do reporters actually want in? That is the question nobody in mainstream sports media wants to answer honestly. And the answer, when you look at it clearly, is equal parts professional habit, institutional entitlement, and something far more uncomfortable, the assumption that athletes' bodies and private spaces are part of the content package. Think about that. These are women who just played 40 minutes of elite professional basketball. They are exhausted. They are injured. They are human beings in the middle of a deeply private physical transition. And the argument being made, dressed up in the language of journalism and fan growth, is that reporters have a right to be in that room. Ben Baby called the WNBA's policy bad for fans and bad for the growth of the game. But here's the thing that should stop you cold. The WNBA just shattered its own viewership records. Arenas are selling out. Jersey sales are exploding. The league is growing at a rate that sports media spent 20 years insisting was impossible. And it did all of that without open locker room access. So either the policy has nothing to do with growth, or someone is not being honest about why they really want inside.
Not a loose practice, but
that brings us to the double standard so glaring, so uncomfortable, that most sports journalists will not touch it with a 10-foot pole. Because while Ben Baby was demanding access to women's locker rooms, female reporters have been walking into men's locker rooms every single day for decades. And what they have described happening in those rooms will completely reframe everything you just heard. Every single day of the NFL season, female reporters walk into locker rooms full of undressed male athletes. They have been doing it since 1978, when Sports Illustrated reporter Melissa Ludke sued Major League Baseball for the right to equal access. She won, and the precedent that ruling set has shaped American sports journalism ever since. So the next time someone frames locker room access as a simple, neutral, professional standard, remember that the entire system was built through a legal battle fought by a woman trying to do her job in a space that didn't want her there. The irony of that history, given this controversy, is almost too sharp to ignore. But here is what that history actually proves. Female reporters gained locker room access because they needed it to compete professionally. They were being locked out of the same conversations, the same quotes, the same stories their male colleagues were filing every night. The access argument, in that context, was genuinely about journalism. So ask yourself, is that what is happening here? Is Ben Baby being locked out of quotes his competitors are getting? Is ESPN being scooped because WNBA post-game interviews happen in a media room instead of locker room? Or is something else entirely
out running? Here's Diamond to Shields for the easy
two. That almost nobody reporting this story mentioned. Multiple female journalists who regularly cover men's locker rooms have described the environment in terms that are, to put it diplomatically, complicated. Unwanted exposure, uncomfortable proximity, moments that would end careers if the gender dynamic were reversed. These are not fringe accounts. They are documented on-record descriptions from credentialed professionals doing serious work. And yet the system is treated as the gold standard, the thing every league should aspire to, the benchmark of legitimate sports coverage. That framing should bother you. It should bother you a lot. If the double standard hiding inside this story surprised you, you already know why hitting subscribe matters. This kind of analysis is what we do here, and there is a lot more coming. Don't miss it. Now enter Caitlin Clark, because you cannot understand why this controversy exploded with this particular force at this particular moment without understanding what Clark has done to the WNBA's media ecosystem. In her rookie season, she didn't just draw fans. She drew an entirely new class of media attention. Outlets that hadn't assigned a single reporter to the WNBA in years suddenly had full coverage teams courtside. Journalists who had never watched a full women's basketball game were filing daily takes. The Caitlin Clark economy didn't just grow the league. It imported a wave of media professionals who brought all of their existing habits, assumptions, and entitlements directly into a space that had its own culture, its own norms, and its own hard-won boundaries. Ben Baby is, in many ways, a symptom of exactly that collision, not the cause, the symptom. And here is a dual fact that makes this undeniable. Not only has WNBA attendance grown by over 48% in the last 2 seasons, but the league's social media engagement now regularly outperforms the NHL and MLS on a per-game basis. The league is not struggling for exposure. It is not dying for coverage. It is thriving on its own terms, which means the argument that locker room access is a growth tool isn't just weak. It is statistically contradicted by the league's own trajectory. So what was this really about? Power. Specifically, who gets to set the terms of access in space that is finally undeniably valuable. For 20 years, sports media ignored the WNBA because it could. Now that ignoring it is no longer an option, the instinct isn't to respect the culture that built the success. The instinct is to walk in and demand the keys. And that is exactly what Marcellus Wiley, a former NFL Pro Bowler who has spent years as one of sports media's sharpest voices, decided to address directly, on camera, without flinching. What he said didn't just push back on Ben Baby's argument. It dismantled the entire premise and left the room completely silent. Marcellus Wiley looked straight into the camera and said what every honest person in that conversation was already thinking. He pointed out that the WNBA is not obligated to import the standards of the sports media infrastructure that spent 2 decades treating it like a punchline. That access is earned through relationship, through respect, through consistent and serious coverage, not demanded the moment a league becomes profitable enough to be worth covering. He framed it simply. You don't get to ignore someone for 20 years, show up the moment they're successful, and then call their boundaries wholly ridiculous. That is not journalism. That is entitlement wearing journalism's clothes. And the silence that followed said everything. Because Wiley wasn't speaking as an outsider. He spent years in NFL locker rooms. He knows exactly what that environment looks like, sounds like, and feels like. He knows the difference between access that serves the story and access that serves a reporter's comfort. And his verdict was unambiguous. The WNBA's policy isn't a barrier to good journalism. It is a reasonable boundary set by a league that has watched the media ignore, diminish, and undervalue its athletes for a generation. The policy isn't the problem. The entitlement asking for its removal is. Here is what almost nobody in this debate bothered to research. The WNBA's post-game media access policy is not some informal workaround. It is a structured league-wide protocol specifically designed to give credentialed reporters full interview access to players and coaches in a controlled, professional environment immediately after games. Every major quote you have read from a WNBA post-game this season came from that system. It works. It produces journalism. The only thing it doesn't produce is the physical proximity to undressed athletes that some reporters have apparently decided is a professional necessity. That is not a small distinction. That is the entire argument. Now step back and look at the bigger picture, because this controversy is not going to be the last one. It is a preview. The WNBA is entering a phase of growth that will attract more media, more money, and more of exactly this kind of pressure. The question of who controls access and on whose terms is going to be fought over and over again in the next 5 years. And the leagues, the athletes, and the journalists who cover them are all going to have to decide what kind of sports media culture they actually want to build. Here is the emerging reality that should be on every WNBA fan's radar. Several sports media analysts have begun openly discussing a hybrid access model, one that maintains a protected post-game interview room as the primary media environment, while offering small rotating pools of credentialed reporters optional facility access during non-sensitive windows. It would preserve athlete privacy while addressing the few legitimate journalistic concerns buried underneath all the noise. It is a kind of solution that gets reached when both sides are actually negotiating in good faith. The problem is that Ben Baby's tweet was not good faith. It was a declaration. And declarations don't start negotiations. They start wars. What this story ultimately exposed is something the sports world has been quietly avoiding for years. The assumption that professional athletes, regardless of gender, owe the media unlimited access to their bodies and their private spaces in exchange for coverage is an assumption that has never been seriously examined. It got grandfathered in during an era when athletes had no platform, no leverage, and no choice. That era is over. WNBA players have millions of followers. They control their own narratives. They have the receipts on every outlet that buried their highlights at midnight for 2 decades. And they are no longer interested in pretending that the reporters who ignored them are now entitled to stand 3 feet away while they shower. That is the real story underneath the outrage and the trending topics. A league that built itself without the media's help is now being asked to hand that media unrestricted access, and it is saying no. Caitlin Clark didn't just bring new fans to the WNBA. She made it impossible for sports media to keep looking away. And in doing so, she forced a collision between 2 very different ideas about what coverage actually means. And Marcellus Wiley said the quiet part out loud. Respect the house you refuse to visit for 20 years before you start rearranging the furniture. The debate over locker room access will keep surfacing. But the deeper question, Who gets to define the terms of access in a league that built its renaissance on its own terms? That one is just getting started. This video is for informational and entertainment purposes only. It is not professional legal, financial, or sports industry advice. Always consult a qualified expert before making any decisions.